Welcome back. So Kenyans undertook a major tree planting campaign yesterday to mourn victims of recent flooding that left around 230 people dead and at least 200,000 homeless. So President William Ruto set the target of planting 200 million trees to mark the National Day of Mourning. Kenya, along with other parts of East Africa, has been overwhelmed by floods. More than 235,000 people are displaced and living in dozens of camps. More than 1,000 schools were affected by the heavy rain and flooding, and funds have been set aside for renovations. Well, joining us now to give us the latest, we are joined by Kenya Amnesty International's Executive Director, Mr. Irungu Houghton. Irungu, good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Hard to imagine that you've had the floods, the rains go on for weeks, and then a tropical storm also hit the area quite recently. I mean, explain what the situation looks like right now in Nairobi.
If you were in one of the informal settlements or very close to one of Kenya's many dams, it is a very scary moment. A lot of people are frustrated, they're fearful. The rains are not ceasing, and therefore we are still bracing ourselves for further damage and devastation. The numbers that we have as Amnesty International Kenya now reach 270 dead, 280,000 displaced, and billions of shillings worth of property destroyed, including public infrastructure, but also private homes. And therefore, you know, it's really one of the biggest catastrophes, and I guess we would say one of Kenya's worst climate emergencies. Probably since 1960s. Many of the elders are saying that they've not seen this level of rain since 1961 and that flood.
Yeah, alarming numbers there, 270 dead. That's the update, of course, from Irungu Houghton, and 280,000 now displaced as a result of those rains. And look at just look at those images. I believe yesterday declared a public holiday. What was the turnout of those that have come out to in that tree planting exercise that has been, of course, initiated by President William Ruto?
The announcement of a public holiday, really the notice was very short. It was a 48-hour notice, and therefore I think many people were unclear what to do. But the initiative is a presidential initiative. He seeks to plant 15 billion trees by 2032, and this is very much geared towards reducing greenhouse emissions, stopping the deforestation that has been happening over the last couple of decades, and restoring, 5 million acres or hectares of deforested land. But a lot of people, probably spent the day at home. Some people went out into the informal settlements. A number of our comrades went and provided shelter, organized kitchens for people who are displaced. And I suspect many parents spent the day thinking about the opening of schools in a couple of days' time. On Monday, it's expected that something like 1,500 schools may not be able to open because their infrastructure has been destroyed by the rains.
Sure. So one can only imagine then just how much money needs to be put in just for the repair of infrastructure. And then, of course, for aid for the hundreds of thousands that are now displaced. I mean, let's talk about whether there's satisfaction with government's plan then to deal with the fallback of this tragedy.
Yes, I mean, the humanitarian organizations, Kenya Red Cross and others, would tell us that, disaster preparedness doesn't happen in the moment of a disaster. It happens prior to that. And therefore, the first challenge has been, why was there not state action to prepare for the warnings that came from the weathermen and women 6 months ago? And therefore, in many ways, the government was caught flat-footed. There were days when we wanted to see a rapid response. We wanted to see, for example, the country's Navy divers going into the rivers to retrieve bodies to help people escape from the raging waters. We wanted to see registration officers providing relief documents, birth certificates, driving licenses, identification documents, and also school certificate documents, but that was not the case. There was a quick response which was pragmatic in the sense that many of the people who were at risk were living on riparian reserves, particularly up and down Kenya's many rivers. Some people were living below dams, and those dams had begun to overflood, and particularly the case of Mahio, an area just outside of Nairobi, between Nairobi and Naivasha. We saw over 50 people die as a disused railway track or tunnel flooded, and just destroyed an entire village almost in a matter of hours. So in many ways, there was very little action prior to the flooding that we've seen. What we've now seen is a number of actions that the president and the cabinet have taken. They have, of course, closed schools. They have instructed people to move from their riparian areas or areas that are prone to flooding. They have started talking about compensation for people who have lost property and their loved ones. And for many people, there is still a concern that perhaps this is not moving fast enough and that they may not be transparent, inclusive strategies, particularly involving the community-based organizations like Pussy Power Organization, the Mother Dare Social Justice Network, and various others who have really been concerned about their residents. And many of these residents are still living on the first floor of temporary or semi-permanent infrastructure, which is still within the range of the river should the rains increase. So therefore, there is a real concern that that there may not be enough action taken so far. We've not heard anything about support for relocation. We've not heard anything yet about accountability. Who will be held accountable? Because as a sovereign state, Kenya has signed several international agreements, up to 20 regulations. And we have a constitution that simply says that Kenyans cannot be exposed to indignity, cannot be exposed to danger when the government is functioning. We have yet to see the government consider and announce under Article 54 of our constitution a state of emergency. And therefore, of course, all eyes are on government to make sure that there is adequate funding that is allocated to essentially responding to the conflict.
Sure. I mean, it's...
Sorry, the crisis.
100%. And, obviously there's that lackluster, if you will, view or response from government after the disaster has taken place. But there's a bigger discussion as well, isn't there, Irungu, around just how African states really are prepared enough in dealing with climate disasters. I think back to COP in 2022 at the beginning of the year in Egypt, and around how a lot of the discussion certainly was about the need to capacitate African states with the tools necessary to precurse disasters before they come and have the right, I suppose, capacity to prepare for that. Where is that discussion then sitting at the moment? And is there any collaboration then in that sense that could possibly come between countries like Tanzania and Nairobi that are equally hit by a disaster like this?
Yeah, no, you're spot on. I mean, I think the international climate change conversations have perhaps been overly preoccupied with the issue of carbon markets. And of course, President Ruto has been a champion for looking at how to, reforest many parts of the world, and in particular Africa, where we have, in many ways, still the opportunity to provide carbon markets to act as sinks for the carbon emissions that the global north are producing and have refused to bring down the amount of carbon emissions. But I think we need to now think much more decisively around, how do governments respond to climate emergencies? I mean, the issue of adaptation, mitigation, and emergency response must be on the agenda now. And I think Kenya has to lead this conversation, because in many ways, the lack of a sustainable land use policy, the lack of urban planning, the lack of, information and communication systems that allow for people who are downstream, for example, to know that the rain is essentially expanding dramatically the river ahead, and to have government services with civil society. I mean, this is the thing. I think civil society are very open to the idea of working with governments to actually relocate people out of danger. But just simply these requests are not being made. The analysis is not being provided downstream. And therefore, what we have essentially is many governments beginning to look like deers caught in headlights, or gazelles caught in headlights, with no capacity to respond. So I think it does need, the international climate change talks do need conversations. I think one other area that would be important to raise as Africa really is the idea of climate refugees. We are very familiar with refugees or asylum seekers who seek sanctuary, and Kenya, of course, is the host to some of the largest camps in the world. But we have yet to think a little bit about what does it mean for people fleeing climate emergencies rather than complex political violent crises.
Yeah, because that essentially when you get to these conferences, you talk about, you know, the conversations around climate refugees becomes a conversation on an agenda. But here for 280,000 people, it's quite the reality. And a frightening
Right,
reality,
absolutely.
a frightening reality as well. Are you optimistic, though, that we'll get there, that we'll get to the capacity? I mean, at this point, I suppose, for a nation like Kenya and even for Tanzania, the work becomes now recovery from the disaster. And, of course, then there are fears of what is next, what other disaster could hit us next. I mean, are you concerned that we may never build the capacity to then prepare for more disasters?
Concerned, yes. Pessimistic, no. As Amnesty International, we are trained, both our staff and our members, really to remain pragmatic, to remain rooted in the rule of law, to remain fearless and challenging of states that do not take their human rights obligations seriously. And I think that is really the position that all citizens and public officials should take, which is, you know, it doesn't help anybody to be denialist about climate change emergencies that we're seeing. It doesn't help our people to essentially, you know, overlook the need for disaster preparedness and climate change management. So I think we have to get louder, we have to get more direct, and we have to be much more influential over our governmental priorities. Because if we see a repeat of this, as we've seen, you know, in the last 3 weeks or so, we will see hundreds die, and several thousands, hundreds of thousands continue to be really at the subject of floods, frustration, and ultimately just fear.
Okay, just lastly, economic implications that you think we're going to be seeing?
I think it's probably going to be felt at maybe 3 levels. I mean, one of the things that in you know, in an op-ed that I released this morning, I said that I would have liked to have seen my president not only call for a public day to plant trees and to mourn the dead, but also that he announced a moratorium on debt repayment, even if it's for a few months, simply to just make the point that we cannot be paying creditors when our people have died and there is so much devastation in the country. The actual cost of what has happened, we suspect will be in the billions. Much of it is in the informal sector, so therefore it is difficult to tell what that means. But, you know, having walked through Mathare last Wednesday, talking to people, you know, who literally now just have one pair of clothing. They have neither their house utensils, they have no school books for their children, they have lost relatives. The costs are just, you know, astronomical, I suspect. But it will take some days really to get a sense of what that means. We've also lost a lot of public infrastructure. And in a number of occasions, I think there was a blackout about a week ago for several hours, as you know, and that, of course, impacts on mainstream industry as well. So I think, you know, we're going to see a lot of costs as a result of this.
Sure.